paper was tied to the introduction, to the writing of the introduction. So there'll be obvious resonances, but I'm not, of course, in the talk going to be addressing the introduction directly. Some of the concepts will appear. So I'll just get started. So for those of us that are hoping to never hear mention of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, or altcoins following the frenzied buy-ups and subsequent crashes of late 2013 and 2017, there's bad news, to say nothing of NFTs. At present, the prices of Bitcoin in the universe of variously conceived cryptocurrencies that have tended to trace its market movements are once more soaring until this afternoon. From early October 2020 to November of 2021, the price of a single Bitcoin token has gone from roughly $10,000 to nearly $68,000, re-inspiring the hopes of the crypto faithful and the inevitability of a future beyond centralized banking, and leaving the rest of us to dread the jargon of computational libertarianism. The speculative betting driving this recent price action, however, belies a more rudimentary and overlooked shift in the digital economy signaled by cryptocurrencies, and Bitcoin in particular. Tech evangelists and tech skeptics both frequently take as their starting premise that value in a digital information economy is a function of efficiency. Immense computational power and novel algorithmic approaches are supposed to aid in collecting, transforming data into an actionable, refinable resource that bypasses the slow, cumbersome work of human interpretation. Whether this is seen as a prelude to a bad computational totality or a miracle of human self-improvement, the underlying assumption is a holdover from an earlier industrial model that understood increased speed and efficiency as a means for extracting increased profit from work done. For Bitcoin, which produces value not through work, but through proof of work, this is distinctly not the case. In place of efficiency, it relies on increased work. In place of simplification, it substitutes complexity. This is a situation, I'll argue today, that stands to invert prevailing notions of value in the digital economy. And because this value stems from processes that destroy information through irreversible modes of encryption, traditional notions of meaning as well. What the techniques of Bitcoin offer, for all of their seeming obscurity, is a model of value based on systems of increasing inefficiency that might assist in coming to terms with a computational economy whose primary resources, data, are produced rather than extracted, and whose black boxed processes often occlude rather than clarify. The pandemic has forced most of us to notice that there's a radical transformation underway in the relationship between work and value that has accompanied the transition from a production economy to an information economy. However, conceptual vestiges of the former still define our understanding of the latter. It is common parlance to speak about data as being harvested, mined, or extracted, and most will be familiar by now with the idea of mining cryptocurrency, I suspect. References to natural resource extraction, in addition to depending on outmoded industrial age metaphors.
I'm sorry, Jeffrey, you know that your presentation is not on yet.
What's that?
I mean, that you haven't started your keynote.
Oh, thank you for, wait, no, this is,
I'm sorry.
Right. Thank you. There it is. Oh, I thought it was still sharing. Makes sense. Okay. So there you have it. From the internal documents of from the internal publication of the NSA. Let's see. Let's make sure that. Okay. All right. So, all right. So, everyone, I'm back. References to natural resource extraction, in addition to depending on outmoded industrial age metaphors, also suggest a process in which work functions to refine materials towards usable commodities. From the earthly plenum, we get crude elements that are then processed, assembled, packaged, and put to market, undergoing ever greater differentiation. The information of the information economy, however, actually invents its own plenum by generating unimaginably large data sets, and much of the work is dedicated to amassing, storing, and encrypting rather than extracting and refining something already extant. Under such conditions, value hinges on calculated inefficiencies driven by ever-increasing complexity. It's just one tiny example that is itself extremely large, a partnership between Social Science One at Harvard's Institute for Quantitative Social Science and Facebook, Metaverse, made a data set available to researchers that involves processing about an exabyte or a quintillion bytes or billion gigabytes of raw data from the platform that contains more than 10 trillion numbers summarizing information about 38 million URLs shared worldwide, more than 100 times publicly on Facebook between January 2017 and 2019. And this is a small fraction of the data Facebook generates and from which it reaps its immense profits. The monstrously large and energy-intensive data centers, whose endless racks of circuit boards make such feats of data production possible, already use about 200 terawatt hours per year, more than the total usage of Iran, and are expected to increase 15-fold in the next 10 years. One would be hard-pressed to claim in the case of Facebook that the nearly $71 billion of revenue they generated from data sets related to the attention economy, including geolocation, consumer and social behaviors, automation, and biometrics, was the result of increased efficiency. This is something that Langdon Winner had already partially identified in 1977 when he noted that the dangerous belief in a cult of efficiency extended the ends means principle of scientific management from early industrial production to contemporary technical systems for which they were no longer appropriate. Writing, efficiency, the quest for maximum output per unit input, is, no one would question, of paramount importance in technical systems. But now efficiency takes on a more general value and becomes a universal maxim for all intelligent conduct. Is the most product being obtained for the resources and effort expended? The question is no longer applied solely to such things as assembly line production. It becomes equally applicable to matters of pleasure, leisure, learning, every instance of human communication, and every kind of activity, whatever its ostensive purpose. But now speed is taken to be an admirable characteristic in itself. The faster is superior, whatever it may be. As of 2017, the contemporary digital economy was estimated to account for 15.5% of global GDP, which has grown 2.5 times faster than global GDP over the past 15 years. But it's not hard to see such growth as a rapid metastasis of a conceptual misapplication of efficiency described by Winner, in that the source of value in such an economy only superficially serves what he called the quest for maximum output per unit input, but in practice abides by a profoundly different logic. Where criticisms of data capitalism are right to attack the rhetorics of efficiency endlessly deployed in support of new digital practices, they often do so by framing the dystopian mechanisms of value extraction as extensions of an industrial economy. This is where cryptocurrencies, and specifically Bitcoin, become so instructive for understanding the changing nature of value in the new information economy. They reveal new patterns of value production essential to contemporary digital practices and open a possible horizon of critique that is not dependent on assuming a limitless extension of older industrial modes of exploitation. Bitcoin marvelously enacts a measure of value quantified in terms of computational squander, quietly but decisively upending the optimization credo that has propelled both technological utopianism and its critics. What Bitcoin captures beneath all of its terminological arcana is a counterintuitive relationship between work and value that undergirds much of the new computational economy. Furthermore, the cryptographic hashing algorithm it uses to quantify the amount of computational power committed to running the distributed ledger system relies on destroying meaning. It employs cryptographic tasks of escalating difficulty that are not intended to secure and protect meaning, as is the case of encryption for clandestine services or internet security, but to destroy it in the process of computational excess, whose reward is an accursed token of cryptocurrency. In this move from work to proof of work, where information is the key resource, the computational processes whose escalating inefficiencies serve as the mode of quantification work against traditional economic aspirations towards efficiency, and simultaneously against the humanistic desire for meaning and comprehension. Bitcoin works through a peer-to-peer network of processors that record and verify transactions as a series of blocks that form an irreversible sequence called, as we all know now, the blockchain. In order to ensure that all the nodes in the system are working with the same ledger and to prevent bad parties from either spending their tokens multiple times or improperly acquiring tokens, there must be a mode of verification. But with no central authority keeping the books, the question is how all the nodes are supposed to achieve consensus, and further still, how someone seeking to corrupt the system can be stopped from faking the ledger or recording bogus transactions. This is related to what is called the Byzantine generals problem. It relies on a thought experiment in which multiple units in an army planning a siege requiring a coordinated attack at a single time can be sure that the messages sent through their enemy territory between them are the same and have not been rewritten by some nefarious interloper. To be able to overcome the presence of a bad actor without the failure of the informational system is called Byzantine fault tolerance, or BFT. And it is perhaps already clear all of these problems are deeply bound to issues of signification, representation, and theories of reference. In other words, they deal with how we maintain faith in the interpretation of messages. Bitcoin's answer to these problems comes in part in the form of a cryptographic hashing algorithm. The cryptographic hashing function at the core of Bitcoin uses difficult computational problems to unlock tied to unlocking units of currency, ensuring a nearly impossible to falsify record of the system's distributed ledger. The virtue of these cryptographic processes is that they institute time-consuming, work-intensive demands on the processors that make up the peer-to-peer network, whose work forms the basis of the transactions. By hashing, they also, however, annihilate any traced characteristic of their initial inputs. As I'll argue, the hashing algorithm used to unlock new tokens and to protect the fidelity of the ledger marks a significant departure from older, enduring ideas of value as an economic, physical, and hermeneutic concept. But let's talk about good old-fashioned work for just a second. So following on the heels of the physiocrats and the political economists of the 18th century, the modern concept of work emerged alongside the development of the laws of thermodynamics. This was a distinctly industrial era revelation. Indeed, Hermann von Helmholtz in 1847, in his essay in The Conservation of Force, he observed that, quote, heat is the new form in which quantity of work may appear, unquote. A fact tightly bound to his observations of quickly proliferating steam-powered machines that were both enabled by and conspicuously suffered from heat loss. In this thermodynamic view, the entire natural and human world was conceived as what Anson Rabenbach has called a vast machine capable of producing mechanical work. Human labor understood in purely thermodynamic terms was submitted to the same standards of thermal efficiency that governed the work of machines whose merciless heat created the stifling milieu in which it was performed. The lived conditions of this entropic hell of combustion capitalism have been endlessly detailed by observers and critics of its brutality. This was a heat so intense that John Andrews Finch said it was, quote, difficult to convey to understanding of anyone who's never visited a mill, and Friedrich Engels described the impacts of similar conditions on his tour of Manchester factories in the 1840s, noting, for instance, that young children working in extreme heat of the factories experienced terrible, quote, premature age and debility, unquote. Suffering and surplus alike were quantifiable in terms of heat. The excesses of machine-driven capitalism revealed themselves as a measurable byproduct of inefficiencies that physicists had identified as an inevitability of all mechanical processes. True to the science of this period, Engels engineered a marriage of Marx and Helmholtz that had the law of conservation as its centerpiece. Heat loss was a counterproductive excess at the heart of all mechanical processes, just as surplus value was the, quote, appropriation of unpaid labor and the basis of the capitalist mode of production, unquote, that scientific socialism sought to diagnose and undo. To reduce the thermal excesses of the mechanical process, meaning its inefficiencies, was to increase the excesses of surplus value. Thus, the physically inescapable obstacles of production signified for the excesses inherent in machine production, whose reduction remained the goal for industrialists and scientific managers looking to increase the capture of surplus value. As Moish Bastone has written, all the scientific, technical, and organizational knowledge and practice that emerged in the course of industrial capitalism's development was geared toward ongoing increases in productivity and efficiency. Okay, so this is not, as we shall see, the case for an information economy born of the explosion of mainframe and then personal computing in the late middle 20th century, even if many of the horrors of industrial capitalism remain intact. So my intention isn't to say that we've overcome industrial capitalism and now are entirely, that there's been a total shift from industrial to computational capitalism. But the computational economy presents a different case. As we know from Friedrich Hitler, Alan Turing's universal machine and its supposition of an infinite tape suggesting limitless computability doesn't actually exist. And for all of their supposed virtuality, real microprocessors are also material technical systems that produce heat, lots of heat. No wonder then there's been such an interest in building the enormous server farms driving information-based revenues in the darkness near the Arctic Circle, including Facebook's, metaverse, monstrously large data centers in Luleå, Sweden, and Microsoft's Natick project exploring the possibilities of deep sea data centers off the coast of Scotland's Orkney Islands. No doubt the often cold waters of Seneca Lake offer similar motives for the Greenidge generation plant equidistant between Rochester University and Ithaca, where I am currently, which has refunctioned a coal-burning plant as a gas-powered Bitcoin mine. While such projects consume 40% less power than run-of-the-mill server farms, thus linking the computational economy to principles of efficiency prevailing for 200 years, the nature of surplus itself has changed. Very little of the ends-means logic of production remain. The nature of and meaning of work in its most basic sense no longer accords with traditional models of value in an economy where 70% of global GDP is the result of service value-added sectors that are defined as industries that produce no goods. In many cases, the computation-based information economy often creates value through inefficiency, a fact captured in its purest form by Bitcoin. The stability of communication, storage, and exchange systems that account for such a large portion of the contemporary economy requires redundancies and complexities that are not identical to the production of value, but increasingly the source of it. In many cases, communication, data collection, processing, and storage no longer facilitate value production, but instead are value production. The storage, processing, and encryption of all this data has become big business, and one that is not simply a secondary outcropping of existing production processes. AWS, Amazon's cloud computing service, accounted for 12% of the company's total revenue in the third quarter of 2020, and both Google and Microsoft's Azure's cloud services account for many billions of dollars in quarterly income. All of this data must be encrypted and stored. As a result, one is left to wonder what exactly it's all for, as most of the data found in the cloud is itself an excess rather than a means of making other capitalist enterprises more efficient. So now shifting to the meaning part. So in 1975, or already by 1975, Umberto Eco, the wonderful Umberto Eco, in his theory of semiotics, which considered the inseparability of signification and technical systems of communication, created a four-part typology of modes of sign production. The first element was physical labor needed to produce expressions, and the fourth was complexity. In an information economy, these two categories have converged in such a way that the artificial introduction of complexity serves as the precondition for and now defines surplus. Complexity ensures the order and fidelity of the signals, codes, and categories is generated, transmitted, and stored. As Echo noted, complication of the code increases the cost of the entire apparatus, but makes the transmission of information more secure, unquote. Complexity in a system increases specificity, precision, and reduces the chances of meaning being lost. However, it also has material costs. To increase complexity, as is always the case in encryption processes, and the generation of large data sets requires more work, but also is potentially very lucrative. It is a simple observation, but one critical to understanding the technique central to a potentially new form of value production. It is also therefore an insight essential to eventually gaining a better view of the engineered inequality at the heart of the information economy. Where the Adorno student turned neoliberal Daniel Bell would argue in 1974 that technology has not only been the means of raising levels of living, it has been the chief mechanism of reducing inequality within Western society, we must allow ourselves the luxury of believing that by now we know better. No doubt he was right that technology has created a new definition of rationality, a new mode of thought which emphasizes functional relations and the quantitative. However, the belief that such a rationality's criteria of performance are those of efficiency and optimization, that is, the utilization of resources with the least cost and least effort, does not recognize the fundamental departure of computational techniques, which bars one from conflating stunning speed with efficiency. The ability noted by Echo to create and manage symbolic complexity introduces material and operational inefficiencies that likewise ensure control over systems of communication. The paradigmatic case for this historical evolution is blockchain technology, the premise of which derives from cryptographic processes whose purpose is to make things less, not more readable, and less, not more efficient. Whatever one thinks about cryptocurrencies, whether it be that they're a short-lived trend, a utopian tool of the decentralized post-governmental future, a magnificently conceived squander of natural resources, or a fantasy of the terminally online, blockchain technologies exemplify one core of contemporary informational techniques. In its best-known manifestation, Bitcoin, introduced in October of 2008 in a 2008 white paper by the cryptanonymous this is difficult. Anyway, Satoshi Nakamoto. This is expressed in the shift from work to proof of work. As we shall see, the soul of Bitcoin is the destruction of meaning through work. It's based on a computational tool that is at its very core anti-efficient and anti-hermeneutic. This meaning-destroying machine is vast in its scale. As of right now, according to the Cambridge University Center for Alternative Finance, the global Bitcoin network consumes 87.06 terawatt hours of power per year, more than the entire nation of Belgium. That includes all of the televisions, algorithmic traders, tweets, elevators, beer boiling kettles, reading lights, and reckless e-scooters used and misused, mostly misused, in a year. Bitcoin consumes nearly as much energy as Pakistan, the 5th largest nation in the world by total population. And true to the appreciable work being done by the endless racks of field programmable arrays and application-specific integrated circuits, ASICs, assembled specifically to run the secure hash algorithm 256 or SHA 256 that underlies Bitcoin, these processors produce immense amounts of heat. In an interview with Wired, the amateur Bitcoin miner Roman Lutsenko in the Moldovan breakaway state of Transnistria, where the cryptocurrency economy is exploding, convinced his mother to set up a mining rig by telling her, quote, "It's a good heater." Now he says, quote, "She thinks we should put one in every room," unquote. This is the same reason that building has also begun on Bitcoin mines in the Siberian town of Norilsk, one of the coldest places on Earth. The grotesqueness of familiar Bitcoin energy use statistics stems not merely from the appalling use of energy involved, although it is indeed appalling. Rather, the disturbing nature of these numbers corresponds with a sense that all of that energy is being used for nothing. Before turning to look closely at precisely what kind of nothing cryptocurrency mining creates, it is worth returning quickly to some of the technical modes of industrial efficiency that optimize the brutal harvest of surplus data at the beginning of the 20th century. And You can't have a surplus, consideration of surplus without your mandatory quote from Karl Marx. So as Karl Marx claimed in volume 1 of Capital, during the second period of the labor process, that in which the worker's labor is no longer necessary labor, the worker does indeed expend labor power. He does work, but his labor is no longer necessary labor, and he creates no value for himself. He creates surplus value, which for the capitalist has all of the charms of something created out of nothing. Without hewing too closely to orthodoxy or wading into highly nuanced debates about whether labor theory of value has been discredited or was even advanced by Marx at all, the idea of industrial era surplus still holds. In a certain way, surplus value is created from nothing, in that its accumulation increases as work, not to be confused with labor, decreases. This mode of capitalist logic is ultimately eliminative. And as David Harvey argues, quote, innovations that improve efficiency and coordination yield more surplus values for capital, unquote. Historically, in an industrial economy, wherever the physical expenditure of work required to produce a product is minimized, surplus increases, even as the labor invested remains stable. During the first part of the 20th century, efforts to minimize unnecessary work, thereby increasing profitability, developed novel strategies in machine production for eliminating unnecessary, redundant, and suboptimal operations. Advocates of scientific management and psychotechnics, from Frederick Winslow Taylor to Hugo Munsterberg, advanced technical programs for the analysis and elimination of infelicities in production systems. Needless to say, this is not how information systems or cryptocurrencies work to generate their value. So there's been a lot of hand-wringing about the far-out ideologies of many of cryptocurrency's primary exponents, who tend to mistrust centralized, supposedly conspiratorial institutions like banks, treasuries, and monetary funds. Much of this discomfort, it must be said, is rather well-founded. David Columbia, for instance, has recently argued that as they are currently configured, Bitcoin and the blockchain technology on which it rests satisfy needs that make sense only in the context of right-wing politics. Those of us who do not share those politics must therefore view Bitcoin and the blockchain with both skepticism and a clear eye for the political terms and concepts invoked in the discourse surrounding them. In Columbia's formulation here, blockchain software is merely an articulation of an extremely right-wing, extremely online politics of rogue libertarianism. It odds with the notions of public good and nervous about centralized control over everything from finance to personal data. This strikes one immediately as a legitimate concern, and is a worry echoed by Francis Ferguson, who writes, libertarian cryptocurrency partisans see banks, which tend to think of themselves as extra-governmental and as governmental subsidiaries, part of a system designed to compel participation in the money of the particular government. They see the requirement that one use a national currency within particular national boundaries as an involuntary tax and coercive. The libertarian continually questions whether an individual should pay the costs associated with that use. The ideologies at work tend to prefigure and determine the technical tools that serve them, at least in this framing. In both Columbia's and Ferguson's appraisals, bad ideology gives birth to bad technology. However, in understanding blockchain technologies within the political categories defined by the long arc of industrial capitalism, something of technology's profound effect on the emergence and shape of political concepts is lost. Namely, it risks sidestepping the degree to which cryptographic hashing techniques are primary to the production of ideology at the most rudimentary level. And blockchain technologies upset the logic of value production on which much of leftist political critique has traditionally been founded. While the cultural ramifications of Bitcoin's embeddedness as a fixture within the wonky malevolence of conspiracy-driven online forums is not to be underestimated, it can also hide the much larger economic and social impacts revealed by its technical operations. Blockchain technology's genealogy is extensive and serpentine. In the case of Bitcoin, its development is equal parts national security agency, public key cryptography, cypherpunk, anarcho-remailers, and accelerating microchip hardware developments. The idea among cypherpunks, crypto-anarchists, and extropians from Tim May, Wei Dai, Adam Back, Hal Finney, and David Chaum, who developed electronic cash precursors to Bitcoin, among other key cryptographic building blocks, the goal was to create a system of currency whose record and verification of transactions were distributed rather than centralized. Hashing algorithms took shape in the 1950s at IBM through the work of Hans-Peter Luhn on checksum algorithms. As Matthew Kirschenbaum notes, Luhn worked to create a, quote, set of formal transformations to convert alphanumeric file names, keys, into arbitrary but deterministic numeric strings of a predetermined length, unquote, which was useful in indexing and would play a role in strategies of authentication. Yet the method did not function by preserving the structure of the original input, but instead by destroying every vestige of it. This spirit is well maintained in present-day hashing algorithms. In its current form, Bitcoin's hashing algorithm takes an input of any bit length or type, performs a mathematical operation, and returns an output of a fixed length called a digest that acts as a kind of signature. In the case of the secure hash algorithm 256 used for Bitcoin, the output is always 256 bits, represented as the 64-digit hexadecimal number. If the message were the first stanza of Rilke's famous first poem of the Dueniza elegies about terrible angels, for instance, which has 1,056 characters, the SHA 256 algorithm returns a fixed length 64-digit value. If we hashed Bertolt Brecht's Hollywood elegies with a very different take on angels in their city, the output would still be 64 digits. Unlike a symmetrical cipher that takes a plain text, uses a key to transform the text into a ciphertext, and if someone finds the key, the ciphertext can then be reversed into the plain text, hashing destroys information and cannot be, under normal circumstances of classical computing, reversed. So from this digest, we will sadly never get back to Brecht or Rilke's poems about angels. With Bitcoin, each new transaction generates a hash and a timestamp that is then checked by nodes in the system. And if the transaction is approved by a majority of nodes, it is added to a block of transactions that constitute the ledger for a specific period. The block, which includes all of the previous transactions, must now also be given a hash or header that serves as its unique signature. This is where the infamous mining comes in. The Bitcoin system protocol sets a level of difficulty for getting an acceptable hash for a block header. The block header is like a final master hash for all of the previous blocks and transactions within the current block. It's serialized to include the version, previous block header, a Merkle root, which is basically a 32-byte hash of all the transactions in the block, the timestamp for when the miner started hashing the header, and a target threshold for the final header value, and a nonce. The nonce is a 4-byte arbitrary number added to all this information, then run through the hash algorithm. Bitcoin miners take all of the given data from the block, add a nonce to it, run it through the hash algorithm, and see if the output is lower than the target threshold called n bits. The first miner to meet the threshold adds the block to the blockchain, which is distributed across the network, receives a predetermined amount of currency, and the process starts all over again. If the threshold is not met, the miner adds a new nonce, hashes again, and once again hopes for a value lower than the target threshold. The computational work of hashing continues until the threshold is met, which happens approximately once every 10 minutes when a new block is added to the chain. The lower the target threshold is, the more computationally difficult it is to get a block header that qualifies, and the more work that must be performed by all the ASICs heating up Seneca Lake presently. It is possible that the first nonce does the trick, and the lucky processor has an easy day in the mines, but probabilistically this is very, very unlikely. Just to provide a sense for how unlikely how unlikely it is that you get it on your first try. Already as of 2019, the Bitcoin network was estimated to be performing around 60 million terahashes per second. Terahash is a trillion hashes, so that's 60 million trillion hashes per second. Needless to say, the chances of getting it on your first try are vanishingly slim. So every 2016 blocks, a difficulty adjustment algorithm changes the target threshold based on how long the previous blocks took to mine. The more hash power the network has dedicated to mining, the harder the problem is, and thus the harder it is to walk away with an allocation of tokens from successful mining. Not only does the system make it very unlikely that one person alone will have the silicon might to falsify the record, it incentivizes continuing commitment of computational resources to running the whole operation. It is this total arrangement that is meant when one refers to proof of work. In the initial 2008 description, Satoshi Nakamoto looked back to an earlier iteration proposed by Adam Back and Hashcash in 1997, writing that, quote, to compensate for increasing hardware speed and varying interest in running nodes over time, the proof of work difficulty is determined by a moving average targeting an average number of blocks per hour. If they're generated too fast, the difficulty increases, unquote. What all of those ultra-hot ASIC processors dispersed across the world are doing then is racing towards ever higher degrees of inefficiency, proving the strength of the encryption algorithm to prevent blocks from being rewritten. In its initial phases, Nakamoto and his cypherpunk correspondents on the cryptography mailing list were thinking in terms of CPU effort expended to satisfy proof of work. Central processing units were designed to process inputs that were then transformed into legible outputs. They're the versatile brain of the computer and great for performing a broad range of tasks. Early on, the thought was that the highly distributed network of regular computers would lend some of their processing power to the maintenance of the system. However, as the lucrative potential of Bitcoin revealed itself and hashing became more difficult, there was an escalating specialization of hardware deployed for proof-of-work operations as miners began primarily employing racks of dedicated graphics processing units, or GPUs, to the task. GPUs, as their name suggests, were built to handle the increasing graphical intensity of screen-based computers that require greater processing power for a narrower range of objectives. Graphics, especially those used in high-definition 3D visualizations and renderings, are extremely computationally intensive, but involve almost no direct interaction with the user or any of the general-purpose computing needs that the CPU is designed to handle. GPUs, immense parallel architectures, based on hundreds or thousands of cores as opposed to the handful of cores in a CPU, break down big computational problems into smaller problems that are then processed in parallel, as the name suggests, parallel architecture. They are a kind of computational workhorse, which made them great for the single task of hashing. GPUs may be essential to the visually driven screen-based interfaces that have come to define our interactions with computer technologies and which obscure the workings of hardware, but they are functionally farther away from the human semiotic landscape of higher level inputs. The entire universe of human signifying operations associated with word processing, emailing, or graphic user interfaces, cutely known as GUIs, are reducible to and bounded by physical properties of microprocessors that materially instantiate and run on the binary logic of the circuit gate. For all the meaning that they communicate and seeming virtuality of digital interactions they facilitate, processors only signify for differences in voltage and are not limitless in their capacity, but instead governed by the laws of, surprise, thermodynamics that haunt all physical work. GUIs and software arguably obscure the material hardware with their semiotic and perceptual content, whether it be Netflix, video games, Twitter, or object-oriented programming languages. But this is only the case where signification or meaning systems are a question at all. That Bitcoin miners began using GPUs rather than CPUs has nothing to do with their efficiency for producing meaningful content. Quite the opposite. The work of the processor is not obscured by an emergent order of signification. It is what Bitcoin signifies for. It may seem tautological, but proof of work, and hence the creation of valuable Bitcoin tokens, signify exclusively for the meaningless machinations of processors. No wonder then that mining has since shifted away from even GPUs to specially designed ASICs whose sole purpose is to hash with not even a passing interest in graphics, language, or meaning. In this way, the logic of production has been turned on its head. Value is not a matter of the difference between work invested and profit extracted, but an index of pure work whose value is maximized through mounting inefficiency. Perhaps even more remarkable than the fact that Bitcoin shifts from work to proof of work is the fact that the foundation for doing so is cryptographic in nature and therefore functions to destroy the apparent transparency of human meaning systems. In Claude Shannon's 1946 proof of secrecy for one-time pad encryption, he recognized that, quote, in designing a good cipher, we must maximize the minimum amount of work the enemy must do to break it. It is not enough merely to be sure none of the standard methods of cryptanalysis work. We must be sure that no method whatever will break the system easily, unquote. The measure of encryption's success, understood in very material terms, was work. And thus, the value of cryptography resided in the calculated inefficiency of signifying systems that stabilized the selective economy of information. It was anti-hermeneutic by its nature, and the inefficiency measured in work quantified its success. Bitcoin is an even more extreme version of this formulation. Francis Ferguson has claimed that, quote, the question that the blockchain Bitcoin nexus raises is a question about how efficiently a currency can be a technology, unquote. One might also argue, however, it seems that what is at stake is precisely a question of not efficiency, but inefficiency. There's a tendency to dismiss Bitcoin and blockchain more generally as the idiosyncratic outliers of a more mainstream digital culture. Evangelists of the so-called digital or fourth industrial revolution herald the triumphs of seemingly frictionless dissemination of information, universal access to knowledge, and transparency inaugurated with the information economy. Yet this is not where the real value is created. Access has been made the source, not the result of capitalist enterprise in a digital milieu. Bernard Stiegler noted that, quote, a totally computational capitalism is structurally self-destructive, that is, absolutely entropic. The production of enormous data sets and the analytics used for pattern detection and correlation that drive much of the information economy does not correspond to meaningful semiotic content, but instead uses such content as inputs for computational analysis that multiplies the amount of work that must be done. Bitcoin is the pièce de résistance of this new anti-humanistic enterprise. Its proof of work function for creating value from increasing difficulty captures a core mechanism of a system that only appears to thrive on efficiency. To diagnose only the pace of computational capitalism without examining the changing techniques by which it invents its excesses risks missing the processes by which it also creates its inequalities. Where unfaced the information economy is driven toward minimized resistance and transmission and communication, one can see its engine as a process of encryption rather than decryption, hashing inputs towards the only truly 19th century industrial element of its construction, namely heat death. Thanks. Sorry, there's my neighbors are like making a ruckus, so hopefully that wasn't transmitted to the group.
It wasn't. Thank you very much. And if you can turn off your presentation so we can see each other, sure, and then I think that Wade and Byron will start with Q&A. Thank you.
Oh, I didn't see it. Yeah, okay. Now I see the note.
So yeah, if you'd like to, you can ask a question in the chat. You can also raise your hand. It looks like I see a hand raised. So Frank, would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, well, based on what you're presenting, thank you for your presentation. It sounds like an operation like Greenwich in Dresden will have to keep adding more and more computers or GPUs, I guess, if they want to earn the same amount of Bitcoin within a certain amount of time. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, so if the level of participation in the global network were to remain stable, then so basically if there were, the more people that participate, right, the more computational power you have dedicated to the system, the more difficult the problems become, which means, right, so it is a kind of arms race that's being described here. So Greenwich will be pumping ever hotter water back into Seneca Lake, which is why it's placed there in the first place, right? Because it's relatively cold up here. You have this abandoned facility. You can convert it into a gas-powered facility, and all of a sudden you have a power plant with, you know, like a natural source of cooled water, right? For ultimately cooling the processors. But yes, you would have to increase your computational power in order to ensure, you know, I think that they've in the time that they've been operating, which is like roughly a year and a half, I guess, they've minted 729 Bitcoin, which isn't too shabby if you think about it being worth now $55,000 per token in any case.
So that must be why they have a planned expansion to add, what is it, 32,000 more on top of the already 15,000 machines that they have now?
Yeah, and I think that they were planning, I don't know if this is true, but I think that they were planning on recuperating one of the turbines, because one of the turbines in the 1980s was decommissioned, and they're talking about basically repairing the second turbine for the purpose of ultimately producing enough energy in order to double computational power. But yeah, I mean, this is the thing, right? Is that basically there's diminishing returns as you have increasing commitment. So the stability of the system and its success increases the level of inefficiency in the production of the currency, which is sort of conceptually genius, but also extraordinarily destructive.
I have a question. So, I mean, and so part of the question is like, maybe you don't want to go in this direction, but in which case just say so. But I was, you know, like hearing about this stuff and thinking about it, it makes me think like, what's, you know, what, like, I don't know, how did we end up here? Like, why was this kind of where capital had to kind of squeeze into at, or something along those lines? Like, I was, okay, to give a little bit more context, so I was thinking about how at the end of Wiener's cybernetics book, he has this kind of, there's this brief moment where he says like, okay, these ideas have the potential to automate and make work so efficient that it would not, that if we don't come up with a different source of value from like labor, then we have the kind of, we're going to have major social problems. And it seems like, I mean, are you saying that it became so efficient that we could no longer get value out of, in the traditional sense of work surplus value, and so things had to kind of invert and go into inefficiency?
I don't, you know, and I think that's a great example. The Norbert Wiener, like his discussion of automation is like a super, you know, it's a really important touchstone. And, you know, like Marx is also writing about automation in the 19th century, right? And, you know, automation has been variously conceived as sort of the liberatory mechanism that basically frees working people from the necessities of labor. Of course, that's never the case, right? It's always a method for enhancing the ability of, you know, whoever owns the machines in order to extract more value, right? I don't know that it was a natural transition. I just think that the way that computation works, and if you think about, for instance, the attention economy, right? you would be, you would be hard pressed to conceive of the attention economy as functioning on an efficiency model. And this is something that like how do you most efficiently capture people, like sharing memes? Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's a very, like the idea, this sort of hard-nosed industrial ideology that is a part of optimization, even when it comes to like conceptions about how neural nets work, right? Really doesn't take account for how value is produced in an information economy. And I don't know if there's a sense of necessity in that, right? Like, I don't know whether like they had squeezed every last penny that they could have out of like increased efficiency. I think it's more that the techniques, and this is sort of my own media theoretical ideology, I guess, but like, I think that the way that computation works doesn't lend itself, right? It produces a different universe of value and signification than do the machines of the 19th and 20th century. So you have to like look at how the machines work in order to understand, right, how value is produced, because, right, you can't consider, for instance, a writing system absent the technical mode for producing it, right? Like the famous thing about the typewriter, like the typewriter influences the concept of text, movable type, whatever, right? Similarly, I think that computers don't just facilitate a stable industrial notion of efficiency. That's right. Like, I think that they produce consequences rather than accelerate old consequences. So that's sort of an elliptical response to your question. It's like, I don't think that someone just decided like, you know what, this efficiency thing isn't, and there's Finn Brunton has a really beautiful book about the history of digital cash that accounts for all of these anarcho mailers and all of these like early crypto 90s email chains, basically, that describes the emergence of both the politics and the concepts behind cryptocurrencies. And it's really interesting to see how the politics has evolved. But anyway, that's like a little bit far afield. Yeah, I don't know.
No, thanks. I mean, yeah, I mean, that basically answered the question. Yeah, so thank you. Does anyone else, me and Wade are both moderating, so anyone else have some questions?
I've got one. I'm sorry.
No, go for it. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, mine is definitely related, but I was just thinking about kind of there's the sort of potential of something like a blockchain, and then there's the hashing, right? And I think clearly you understand the actual realities of how the software works better than I do, but is there a version of the benefits of a blockchain without a profit motive or something that creates the need for this, kind of virtual imposition of scarcity? Is there a way that something like a blockchain can be used in an egalitarian fashion in the idea of something like the Chilean CyberSyn project or something, some of all these kind of like mythical missed opportunities of automation. Is there a good blockchain?
Well, I mean, I'm sure given the nature of a lot of the people working in cryptocurrency are extraordinarily smart, many times well-intentioned. And I have no doubt that there's a project for some sort of, and I mean, in keeping with, there's a kind of like like a perverse democratic spirit that's built into the belief in decentralized currency, right? Because the idea is to basically, like remove central authority, right? Like you don't want there to be a central authority that dictates policy, that exerts undue control over the financial system, do you know what I mean? So like that was already sort of, right? The reason that it became a distributed network, or it was developed as a distributed network, is anti-hierarchical, right? Of course, how that was realized, like the damaging after effects were difficult to predict, especially because they were thinking about using, as I said in the paper, like CPUs. It was supposed to just dedicate, and it was, like dedicate some extra processing power. And I mean, like your CPU isn't working especially hard. Well, maintain the Bitcoin, like process a transaction or whatever. Ethereum hasn't yet gone to proof of stake yet, and people are anxious about that because it's a very difficult problem. And that's a frequent counterexample that I hear from my friends in the crypto space, right? Is like proof of stake is fundamentally more efficient, but it's a more efficient version of inefficiency, ultimately, right? You've just devised the system where you're incentivizing, right, absent sort of useless computational practice to ensure or to demonstrate commitment to the system, right? And if you make that extraordinarily efficient, it's the techniques of it, right? Like the foundation of it is still a calculated inefficiency, even if you've reduced the footprint of that inefficiency. And there's like Hedera and these gossip chain, and they're like all these like various conceptions that try to get around the energy problem, right? But ultimately, blockchain, insofar as and I'm sure that there's a project I'm totally unaware of, but insofar as I'm aware, there's, right, like the commitment of processing power is the bedrock of blockchain technologies, and that is a fundamentally inefficiency-based system. So you can make inefficiency more efficient, is what I would say. Sorry, I'm going to move this because the sun is now in my eyes. It's shifted from behind me to in front of me. So.
All right, any more questions? Frank, you're gonna need to unmute.
Sorry. Yes. Are there only so many Bitcoins that can be mined, and then there's nothing more to mine?
Yes. So that's a part of the reason that, okay, so there are all of these like little internecine debates, and there's a whole universe of terminology. So one of the reasons that people think that the flippening can't happening, and the flippening is just like Ethereum becoming a more valuable, like Ether becoming more valuable than Bitcoin, is precisely because it's what, 22 million, 21 million tokens that, right? There's a definite end to Bitcoin, which is also why it's treated as a store of value, right? Many people have begun resisting the idea that cryptocurrencies are in fact currencies because they're not useful for exchange. They're highly inefficient in terms of transactions. Of course, Ethereum is much better than Bitcoin for processing transactions, but as a store of value, so something like gold, right? Where you have basically a natural scarcity, but it becomes very interesting when you start thinking of stores of value as built on computational resources, right? That's where you start to see, right, that ultimately the concept driving, or the organizing concept of Bitcoin is this this artificial scarcity that's maintained by constant commitment of processing power. But yeah, so there's a limited number of Bitcoins. So get your Bitcoins now, because they're not making any more. Do you know? It's like real estate. It's like I don't buy real estate because they're not making any more of it, or buy land. I don't remember. I'm not sincerely advocating for you to buy Bitcoin. I'm just, you know.
Have you got any Bitcoins?
I'm sorry, me?
Yeah, you. As an experiment.
No? I have bought and sold Bitcoin since the early 10s. And have always found myself in a financial position where it was exigent that I sell only to kick myself later. So I have sold many, many times over the past 10, 11 years. And it was a sort of fun, exciting, extremely confusing, highly gray legal realm in the early 2010s when you had places like BTCE that didn't even have like a corporate office as like one of the primary exchanges in Bulgaria, and then the founders like went into the wind, and there was this whole like, I mean, it was like very, the intrigue surrounding the early universe of cryptocurrency was very fun from a journalistic perspective. I also have a lot of friends that lost a lot of money in those early phantom exchanges. So anyway. Oh yes, and also Ethan just said Dogecoin. I mean, I'm sure that there are other infinitely mineable coins, but that was also a part of the reason that the sinister force of Musk endorsed it as a global currency, right? Because of it's ultimately more currency because of its fungibility, right? Because you can always print more money, whereas you can't print more Bitcoin.
Well,
hi, Ethan.
Hi. That in Bitcoin doesn't have the looming proposition of Satoshi Nakamoto selling his position.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Dogecoin, I misspoke.
Yeah.
I think Coinbase cited in their original filings to the SEC that one of the hugest business risks was that Satoshi Nakamoto would decide to tank the price of Bitcoin.
Yeah. The Genesis block is a very dangerous proposition because you have this giant whale-like, this like megalithic structure at the center of Bitcoin, which is all the early coins that were mined, like, do you know what I mean? Like with your like calculator. Do you know what I mean? Like Satoshi Nakamoto and all the friends are just like, do you know, like, you know, mining Bitcoin, and they have them, right? Like there's this, what's called the Genesis block, which are the earliest mined coins, and there are a lot of them. And should this figure who continues to remain unknown, were he or she to sell the Genesis block, it would core out the value of the currency. In any case, yes, totally.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me, it's kind of a half-formed thought, but I mean, it makes me think about this very strange relationship between virtual and, like, I mean, if you will, real world value, because I mean, obviously the dollar is in many ways as much of a sort of article of faith as the Bitcoin is, but something where, but people who have actually lost great amounts of, you know, fungible wealth in recognized state currencies due to losing Bitcoin, but also something like massive destructions in massive amounts of destruction in like an online game where millions of American dollars of value in virtual, you know, in-game assets are destroyed. Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, kind of a half-formed thought, but I'm just thinking about this kind of very strange way that wealth can be destroyed in a virtual space.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question. You hear about these people that have like external wallets too. And they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna put like I store my 10 Bitcoin on my flash drive, and I just put it in my pocket, and then I went swimming or whatever. Do you know what I mean? And it's then it's just tears. Do you know what I mean? Like just days of tears because whatever you threw away, like $1.8 million because you decided to take a dip, right? But the interesting thing is that all of that, basically the information, the index for your ownership, right, is ultimately an index for an empty fact of processing, right? Like an empty hash. So what's being destroyed in a certain way is the signifier for the fact of computational squander, right? All of this processing had to happen in order for these coins to come in, or these tokens to come into existence. You have a unique signifier that's, right, like indicates your ownership. And once the signifier is lost, right, that's it. But this relationship between signifying for computational excess as an engine of value, I think is like really, it's really very interesting to me. And is a larger book project that I'm working on, that this will be a part of, on encryption capitalism. This is one of the cornerstones for a computational economy, is the fact of encryption. And most of the rhetoric that we hear about what the digital universe does is that it creates, it democratizes, it increases access to knowledge, right? It allows people from diverse, like from diverse areas in order to come into contact. It's the global village McLuhan notion of sort of like everyone in contact sharing ideas, when in fact, there are darker elements to it, of course, at a fundamental technical level. And I think that I'm interested in how the technical stuff produces consequences that aren't a part of the stated ideology. So yeah.
I mean, I've been trying to formulate another question about this question of value, but what y'all were talking about kind of relates to it. But yeah, I guess I'm just trying to think of like, what does it mean to say something has value, or what is the current theory of value, so to speak, like in this moment? Because I think that, like, on the one hand, you can say, well, there is still all the work that took to make the processors, to make the, to get the oil, to get the electricity grid going, that then gets transferred, like all that does have a kind of chain of work or more traditional ideas of value. But to reduce it to that also seems like to kind of miss another big point, and is there any way to I mean, you touched on this obviously in your talk, but like, how do you kind of reconcile that those various things going on, this very empty hash versus kind of work people are doing to create energy and these commodities that you need to get the hash, and then also the physical environmental impacts of all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, because I always try to be very careful when I talk about this with people to mention, for instance, like the mining of rare earth metals that takes place in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have basically colonial powers competing to exploit minerals, right? Like the extraction of minerals that are required for processors, chips, or whatever, right? That run everything now. That's of course like a part of a very old form of extractive economics, do you know what I mean? Tied to very traditional forms of exploitation, right? That's necessary in order to produce the equipment for things like cryptocurrency, or like onboard automated driving systems, all of that stuff, right? So there's always like a material background to this, right? And in the few arguments that I'm sort of relieved that we don't have any orthodox Marxists, do you know what I mean? Like or maybe we do, but they're just sitting silently behind one of these gray squares. But like one of the complaints is that, well, no, like even if there's a new mode of value production, it can ultimately all be, as you were saying, reduced to all of these material, economic, social relations. But I think that even if those things are required, there's still the mechanism for value production, right, has changed. And there's always going to be a material premise and material forms of exploitation that are involved in these new mechanics of surplus. But yeah, totally. I mean, it's also where you store the waste from these, like that's another, right? Like the vulgar Marxist here. Yes. I didn't say that it was vulgar. I just said, like I said orthodox. But yeah, there's, I think to focus on the technical arrangements for the production of value is not to ultimately, to negate the fact of material, economic, social relations. Yeah, but you're totally right, is what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know, even in a like kind of more even in a like a Marxist perspective, there's a like there is this kind of assertion that, okay, well, you can trace things back to labor to some degree and commodity production and stuff, but at the same time, it's not like financial networks and systems aren't then kind of modulating things and like affecting how capital flows actually like function. And this seems to be a new form, in a way, a new form of how like an abstraction of all these other things, maybe more below, are being modulated.
For sure, in both the intro, with Patrick or Reet and Leaf that we wrote, we addressed this, and also in the longer paper that I have, if you can believe that there's a longer version of it. In the longer paper, I address more of the Marxist objections about the flows of capital and the fact of derivatives also, and the claims about data or the claims against data by people like Joshua Clover, who say that no, indeed, right, it's always facts, right? There are always facts in the world that dictate the production of that or the production of surplus. But yeah, so this is something that I'm like keen to address. It's just that I really find it difficult to think that the systems of excess and signification, the production of surplus that occurs through computation could be best understood through the politics ultimately arrived at in the revolution of steam engines. It just, it doesn't, I don't know. I'm trying to outline a case here for why a different kind, even if you're doing a kind of Marxist analysis, that an orthodox 19th century form of materialism doesn't necessarily account for something like Bitcoin, right? Because the traditional description of surplus is ultimately the opposite, right? It's subtractive. And David Harvey and all of like, this is how David Harvey and Moish Pistone, everyone describes the process of surplus is ultimately creating degrees of efficiency that allow for labor to remain constant and surplus to be increased in recapitalization, whatever, right? Like, so I don't know, I'm going on a bit too much. I'm becoming a bit too like contemplative about this, but it's definitely an issue at the core of this project, is like, what's a leftist politics look like if you take seriously computational techniques? And that's a question that I think remains to be answered.
So that's what you would like to work on for the future, like not only the encryption capitalism, but encryption socialism, or like to adapt it or apply it to the right wing and left wing populism. Can we look at the Bitcoin from that perspective?
Yeah, well, I think that like it's, you know, there's the assignation of, and you see this, and it's not unfounded, but like when you look at Francis Ferguson in Columbia's descriptions of the politics of cryptocurrencies, it's like they don't think that it can be divorced from right-wing politics. I would say, you know, maybe that's true, but what is really absent is a leftist critique that doesn't simply extend the critiques of efficiency and optimization from the industrial economy as, you know, like that being the tool seems insufficient to the problem, basically. And so I think I am kind of interested in developing a program of leftist critique of computation that doesn't find most of its examples in the cotton mills of Manchester in the 1850s. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. I know that this is polemical. I'm not trying to polemicize. I don't know if Alex is still here, but you know, I take seriously the charge of Marxist critique and think that there needs to be something new needs to arise in order to make a compelling criticism of the way that information economy works. So
it will be interesting to hear the Alexander Galloway opinion, since he's the vulgar Marxist.
Well, next week.
Okay.
Next week, I think hopefully there'll be a conversation about that more generally, I think. So
what's going on next week? Are you all meeting each other due to the publication?
There's an event, there's a launch. There's a launch next week, I think, actually 1 week from today at the NYU Center for the Humanities, and all of the authors for the issue, including myself and the other editors, Alex and Luciana Parisi, everyone will be in a kind of, you know, there'll be a conversation about the larger issues of the issue, which will hopefully be out by then. But yes.
So when it's going to be published, actually, that issue?
Soon.
But it will be already 2022, like your.
Yeah, it'll be online, available online, probably sometime in the next couple of weeks, and then the physical copy. So it'll be available through the library very soon.
What about your book? I know it's 12 months, so.
Yeah.
So when do you think your book?
That's coming out at the end of the summer.
The end of the summer.
It's done. It's just, you know, production takes quite a while. So that'll be out at the end of the summer, which seems like a distant horizon at this point. So being up here in New York.
Sorry, I have one more kind of difficult question, probably, which is like, so I don't know if you've read Mackenzie Wark's book about Capitalism is Dead, but you know, for those who maybe also who haven't read in the audience, like she's basically asserting something like that, you know, a kind of similar inversion where, but in a different realm of creative work, where you know, the traditional kind of Marxist critique of capitalism is that we have to become more and more efficient at making very regular, like every can of soup looks exactly the same or whatever, right? But that in the creative economy that we have right now, if you're the same, then you have no value. So you're required to kind of like constantly innovate and write something new or create some sort of new creative thing that can then be, you know, commodified. So I don't know, I was just curious, like, you know, if how you see that working with your work, or, you know, this, maybe not necessarily work specifically, but just this question of like, you know, the creative labor and how that's another kind of an inversion of this efficiency model.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's an important touchstone, I think. And I guess what I would say is just that I'm interested in similar questions, but less interested in the cultural dimension of them. So that book addresses cultural production in a way where I'm more interested in technical how technical arrangements enforce certain economic or ideological modes. That would be the difference. But of course, like, it's very important. I mean, it's a great book, and yeah, it obviously bears a lot of similarity, although it's slightly more polemic than the case that I'm trying. Do you know what I mean? It's like more polemical than the case that I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to be incendiary with this. I'm really trying to do a kind of sober consideration of how technical systems might have changed, right? Like, yeah, change the nature of critique, or yeah, create a new horizon for critique. Yeah. Sorry, my voice is going. So I'm getting very hoarse, and so everything sounds like slightly more aggressive, like I'm growling now.
It's so interesting, actually. It's so good that you agreed to do it, to present for us, and then this discussion.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you. I mean, thank you so much for having me. Sorry about the present, you know, like the keynote presentation. Thank you for reminding me to.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, there's.
I know, because you are enthusiastic about the topic. I understand it. So that you.
Totally.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. Well, thank all of you for your time and the great questions, and I hope that we cross paths virtually or in person in the not too distant future.
Yeah, absolutely. This was really fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the special issue in your book.
Yes.
That's great.
Yes.
Me too.
And thank everyone for coming. And we'll keep you posted about our next DigiTalk. Everyone have a wonderful evening.